Hello, good morning to all. So today's my topic is increased intracranial pressure. So before going to discuss about the etiology and clinical features and pathology and management of increased intracranial pressure, I will briefly describe about the cerebral neurons. And cerebral neurons are fully dependent on the cerebral blood flow and the delivery of oxygen and glucose. Brain stores of glucose provide energy for 2 to 3 minutes after complete cessation of blood flow to the neurons, and the oxygen stores last 8 to 10 seconds after the complete cessation of blood flow to the neurons. So simultaneous hypoxia and ischemia exhaust the already glucose which is present in the neurons more rapidly. So neurons are particularly susceptible to acute ischemic or hypoxic insults and are irreversibly lost when blood flow is restricted to more than 3 to 5 minutes. So rise in intracranial pressure is a major clinical feature of many neurological illnesses. So coming to definition of intracranial pressure, it is the pressure that is exerted on the brain tissue by external forces such as cerebrospinal fluid and blood. So raised intracranial pressure can arise as a consequence of intracranial mass lesions or disorders of the cerebrospinal fluid circulation and more diffuse intracranial pathological processes. So it can be divided into mild intracranial pressure, moderate or severe. So many of the neurological illnesses are caused by primary disorders which are affecting the neuraxis, and sometimes raised intracranial pressure due to neurological illnesses may be present as a consequence of a systemic disorders like multi-organ failure, any systemic infections. So the normal intracranial pressure in a healthy adult is around 5 to 15 millimeters of mercury. Suppose if the intracranial pressure is more than 20 millimeters of mercury, that is defined as intracranial raised intracranial pressure. Suppose if the intracranial pressure is more than 30 millimeters of mercury, that indicates poor prognosis. So coming to the relation of CSF and intracranial pressure. So normally the skull or cranium contains brain, CSF and blood. So CSF is produced principally in the choroidal plexus of the each lateral ventricle and exits the brain via the foramen of Luschka and Mesende and flows over the cortex and absorbed into the venous system along the superior sagittal sinus. This is a normal flow, production and absorption of the cerebrospinal fluid in the skull. So normally, approximately 150 ml of CSF is present within the ventricles, and usually this 150 ml of CSF surrounds the brain and spinal cord. And coming to cerebral blood volume, it is around 150 ml. And so compensatory mechanisms can accommodate an additional 100 ml of fluid in the intracranial volume. Suppose if the volume of the intracranial is more than 200 to 250, that results in increased intracranial pressure. So increased intracranial pressure is directly related to the volume of intracranial contents within the skull. An increase in the volume of intracranial contents or obstruction to CSF outflow or edema of cerebral tissue may increase the intracranial pressure. So further elevated intracranial pressure may diminish the cerebral perfusion and it can lead to further ischemic tissue ischemia. So ischemia and vasodilation usually it occurs in a vicious cycle. Increased intracranial pressure may lead to decreased cerebral perfusion pressure, which results in vasodilatation. Again, it results in increased cerebral blood flow. Again, it results in ischemia. So ischemia may lead to vasodilatation via autoregulatory mechanisms, mainly to restore cerebral perfusion. So vasodilatation increases the cerebral blood volume, which increases the intracranial pressure, which lowers the cerebral perfusion pressure and provokes a further ischemia. So finally, once the intracranial pressure is raised due to cerebral edema, that mainly it results in increased intracranial pressure, and it may also shift the cerebral tissue to opposite side, and further it may increase the ischemia. So in addition to ischemia of impaired perfusion consequent to the elevated intracranial pressure, tissue shifts can cause injury by mechanical distension and compression of the normal neuronal structures. So this is the ischemic cascade usually seen in massive ischemic strokes or global cerebral ischemia and traumatic brain injuries. So what happens in all these conditions like ischemic stroke or global cerebral ischemia and traumatic brain injury? So inadequate substrates like oxygen and glucose to neurons may release the excited amino acids, especially glutamate, which leads to influx of calcium and sodium ions into the neurons that results in disruption of the cellular homeostasis. Again, an increased intracellular calcium levels may activate the proteases and lipases that leads to a lipid peroxidation and free radical mediated cell membrane injury. Finally, that results in edema of the brain tissue. And finally, it may result in necrotic cell death and tissue infarction. So there are two types of brain injury. One is primary brain injury, another one is secondary brain injury. So primary brain injury results from the biochemical effect of forces applied to the skull and brain at the time of the insult, and this primary brain injury usually manifested within a period of seconds. Coming to secondary brain injury, usually it develops within a period of minutes to hours, or sometimes it may take days, and it represents the complicating process initiated by a primary brain injury, such as ischemia, brain swelling, and edema, or intracranial hemorrhage or intracranial hypertension. So patients with primary brain injuries due to trauma or stroke are at risk of ongoing secondary ischemic brain injury. So because secondary brain injury can be a major determinant of a poor outcome of patients with raised intracranial pressure. So strategies for minimizing the secondary brain injury results in an integral part of the critical care of all patients. So this slide is showing so many secondary insults that can contribute to the hypoxic or ischemic brain injury. So among these, so some are intracranial, some are extracranial. So coming to extracranial or systemic insults, secondary insults that can cause a hypoxic or ischemic injury are prolonged hypoxemia, prolonged hypotension, chronic anemia, hypocarbia, hypercarbia, pyrexia, hyponatremia, hypoglycemia, and hyperglycemia. So all these conditions may lead to extracranial secondary insults to the brain. Intracranial secondary insults are mainly due to hematoma, seizures, or infections within the brain tissue. So systemic hypotension, hypoxia may cause further brain injury by reducing the continuous nutrients to the neurons. So like fever, seizures, and hyperglycemia may increase by damage the brain tissue by increasing the cellular metabolism. So coming to brain edema, many types of brain injury can cause swelling or edema of brain tissue. So there are two types of edema. Number one is vasogenic edema. Another one is cytotoxic. Another entity is interstitial edema. So clinically significant brain edema is usually represented by a combination of vascular and cellular components. Coming to vasogenic edema, it refers to the influx of fluid and solids into the brain through an incompetent blood-brain barrier. So this blood-brain barrier may be compromised in so many insults like ischemia or trauma to the brain or infection to the cerebral tissue or metabolic derangements. So usually this vasogenic edema develops rapidly following an injury. Coming to next type of edema, that is cytotoxic edema. It refers to cellular swelling and occurs in ischemia of brain and trauma to the brain. Early manifestation of cytotoxic edema is astrocytic swelling. Coming to etiology of brain edema, there are so many localized mass lesions like traumatic hematomas or subdural injuries or extradural injuries or severe abscesses, and the neoplasms of the brain tissue like glioma, meningioma, metastasis, secondary metastasis of the neoplasm, abscesses. So all these conditions may produce intracranial pressure due to cerebral edema. So there are certain causes of rise in intracranial pressure according to the mechanism. So cytotoxic, vasogenic, and interstitial edema. So as I told in the previous slide. So another one is by increasing the cerebral blood flow, hypoxemia, hypercarbia, hyperpyrexia. So all these conditions causes the rise in intracranial pressure. And some cerebral mass lesions or herniations may also produce increased cerebral pressures, intracranial pressures. So coming to these herniations of cerebral hemisphere, herniation means it is mainly displacement of brain tissue into a compartment that is normally does not occupy. So there are so many types of cerebral herniations: uncal herniation, central herniation, transfacial herniation, foraminal herniation. So all these cerebral herniations may produce uh, increased intracranial pressure by compressing the normal tissues. Coming to manifestations of rise in intracranial pressure, predominantly it is characterized by headache, nausea, and vomiting. Sometimes patients may present with altered mental abilities, confusion, confusion, confusion state, and sometimes patients may present with double vision, or people with abnormalities, shallow breathing. Sometimes patients may present with seizures. Suppose the cause of intracranial pressure is due to cerebral hemorrhage. And sometimes patients may lose consciousness because of massive infarcts or uh, massive intracerebral hemorrhages. So any patient presented with loss of consciousness with premonitory symptoms like headache, nausea, vomiting, blurring of vision, with seizures, then you should suspect increased intracranial pressure due to some cerebral pathology. So coming to diagnosis of raised intracranial pressure due to cerebral pathology. So first we have to consider CT scan or MRI brain, mainly to determine the underlying lesion. So then assess the serum electrolytes to rule out the metabolic causes like sodium, calcium levels, and glucose levels, and rule out the systemic causes by uh, measuring the renal function and the hepatic functions, and complete blood count to rule out any infectious pathology, and coagulation profile. Sometimes serum and urine toxicology is also necessary. So coming to approach to a patient with severe CNS dysfunction. So in this condition, it requires a rapid evaluation and intervention to limit the primary and secondary brain injury. And first you should stabilize the respiratory airway and cardiac and hemodynamic parameters. Then assess the neurological status. So coming to neurological evaluation in a patient with altered status. So first you determine the cause of dysfunction, whether it is a diffuse process or a focal process. So majority of the diffuse process are due to metabolic derangements, and focal process are mainly due to structural abnormalities. The most common causes for diffuse pathology, most probably metabolic encephalopathies related to organ failure, or drug overdose, or hypoxic ischemia. All these conditions may produce diffuse pathology. And coming to focal pathology, so most of the times ischemic or hemorrhagic strokes and sometimes trauma to the brain may also present with focal pathology. So on examination, sometimes we will find out some focal signs like pupillar asymmetry or hemiparesis or gaze palsy or paraplegia. Usually that suggests a possibility of structural lesions. So then we have to consider an urgent neuroimaging to rule out any structural lesion of the brain tissue. So among the so many radiological imagings, CT scan brain is usually sufficient for appropriate localization of structural lesion because it is easy to perform and easily available. And most of the times it can rule out any hemorrhage or hydrocephalus or intracranial shifts. And before going to take for neuroimaging, first you have to rule out any injury to the cervical spine. Suppose if there is a history of a trauma or a history of fall, so by simple X-rays or CT or MRI brain. And sometimes some patients may require EEG to rule out any seizures. And, suppose if you are suspecting any infectious pathology, then you have to consider for lumbar puncture also. Then some patients may require of intracranial pressure. So that is mainly considered for those with primary neurological disorders like stroke, rheumatic injury, mainly because these conditions, patients with these conditions are at risk of secondary brain injury. So can control the further damage. So there are certain indications for monitoring of intracranial pressure. Severe traumatic brain injury, the GCS score is less than 8. With respect to large arterial or ischemic or hemorrhagic strokes, or hydrocephalus from subarachnoid hemorrhage, intraventricular hemorrhage, or posterior further. You have to monitor the patients with pulmonary monitoring of intracranial pressure. So once the diagnosis of then we have to treat the patient. So coming to treatment, the treatment is ideally based on the underlying mechanism which is responsible for the elevated intracranial pressure. Suppose in case of hydrocephalus due to subarachnoid hemorrhage, so in this the principal cause of elevated intracranial pressure is due to impairment of CSF drainage. So ventricular drainage of CSF is first step to be taken in patients with hydrocephalus because of subarachnoid hemorrhage. So like that, in patients with trauma brain or ischemic stroke, so we have to reduce the intracranial pressure by giving some osmotic agents like mannitol or hypertonic saline to decrease the cytotoxic edema. So the early signs of elevated intracranial pressure is mainly drowsiness and diminished level of consciousness. So in case of there is any elevated drowsiness or decreasing consciousness, then we have to imaging to rule out any hemorrhage. The hypotonic hyperfluid should be avoided in patients with raised intracranial pressure, and elevation of the head of the bed is recommended. And patients must be carefully observed for the risk of aspiration and obstruction of the airway as the level of consciousness is decreasing. So coming to emergent management of elevated intracranial pressure, so it should be quickly achieved by intubation and hyperventilation, because hyperventilation causes vasoconstriction and reduces the cerebral blood volume by thereby decreasing the increase in intracranial pressure. So hyperventilation is best used for short periods of time until a more definite treatment can be instituted. And the effects of hyperventilation to reduce the intracranial pressure are short-lived and often lasting only for several hours. And sometimes there will be a rebound elevations of intracranial pressure after abrupt discontinuation of the hyperventilation. So stepwise approach to treatment with elevated intracranial pressure is first you assess the intracranial pressure, then goal for treatment is you should maintain the intracranial pressure less than 20 millimeters of mercury, and cerebral perfusion pressure should be 60 millimeters of mercury. Suppose if the intracranial pressure is more than 20 to 25 millimeters of mercury for more than 5 minutes, then we have to treat the patient with emergency. So first you drain the CSF via ventriculostomy. Suppose if ventriculostomy is done, then elevate the head of the bed to decrease the intracranial pressure. Then you administer the mannitol or hypertonic saline to reduce the intracranial pressure. So the dose of mannitol is 25 to 100 milligrams 4th hourly. And sometimes some patients may require glucocorticoids like dexamethasone 4 milligram 6th hourly, mainly to reduce the vasogenic edema from tumor or abscess. And this glucocorticoid should be avoided in patients with head trauma or ischemic or hemorrhagic strokes. So glucocorticoids are indicated only in infectious pathology or tumors. Some patients may require sedation, like morphine or propofol or midazolam, if necessary. So the patients are very irritable, so we have to give some sedation. And hyperventilation. Sometimes patients may require pressure therapy to maintain the pressures, so like dopamine or norepinephrine, to maintain the mean arterial pressure and cerebral perfusion pressure around 60 millimeters of mercury. Suppose with these methods, if the patient, if the increased intracranial is not reduced, then we have to give uh, some aggressive hyperventilation. Sometimes they require high dose barbiturate therapy in phenobarboma or hypothermia, and sometimes patients may require hemicraniectomy in case of massive hemorrhage or massive infarcts. So that is about intracranial pressure. So normal intracranial pressure is around 10 to 15 millimeters of mercury. Suppose if the intracranial pressure is more than 20 millimeters or 20 to 25 millimeters of mercury, that is called raised intracranial pressure. So there are so many causes for raised intracranial pressures: primary disorder, primary brain injury, and secondary brain injury. So there are two types of edema: cytogenic and cytotoxic edema. And another one is interstitial edema. So the main characteristic features of rise intracranial pressure is severe headache, unbearable headache with nausea, vomiting, projectile vomitings, and sometimes patients may present with seizures. So CT or MRI is investigation of choice to rule out the cerebral pathology, and by simple measurement of electrolytes, glucose, and hepatic renal function, or CBC. So management, coming to management. So first we should assess the airway, blood pressure, and suppose if the ventriculostomy is in place, drain the CSF to decrease and increase intracranial pressure, and elevate the head of the bed, and osmotherapy with mental or hypertonic saline, and glucocorticoids in case of infectious pathology. And suppose if the patient is irritable, you should sedate the patient, and hyperventilation decrease the intracranial pressure. Suppose if the patient is in hypotension, we have to give pressure therapy. And for refractory elevated intracranial pressure, they require high dose barbiturate therapy, aggressive hyperventilation, hypothermia, and sometimes hemicraniectomy. This is about rise in intracranial pressure. So in the next class, we will discuss about cerebrovascular accidents, ischemic strokes, or hemorrhagic strokes.